Timidity rarely announces itself loudly. It begins in the smallest, softest ways: a child pausing before speaking, a child scanning a parent's face before answering a simple question, a child waiting to understand whether the room is safe before letting their personality appear. Most people don't remember the exact moment this hesitation was born, but they remember the feeling, the quiet tightening in the chest, the instinct to hold back, the sense that expressing too much might create a ripple they didn't know how to control. In many homes, silence becomes a form of intelligence. Children learn that the safest place is the space between their words. They study the atmosphere long before they study themselves. The house may not be violent, but emotions can still be unpredictable. A parent's sigh, a sudden shift in tone, a disappointed look, such small things become signals the child is always trying to decode. And so timidity begins not from weakness, but from awareness. Awareness far too heavy for a young mind. A timid child often grows up watching the world instead of joining it. They listen more than they speak. They observe more than they participate. They hold thoughts inside because releasing them feels like stepping onto thin ice. The world outside their body feels louder, sharper, and more sensitive than the world within. Even in moments where they want to express themselves, there is a shadow of hesitation trailing behind the desire. They want to be heard, yet something inside whispers that visibility carries risk. In homes where emotions are not welcomed, timidity becomes a kind of emotional armor. Parents who dismiss feelings, even unintentionally, teach the child that expressing themselves leads to correction or misunderstanding. A child who hears "stop crying, don't act like that," or "you're being dramatic" learns quickly that their emotions are inconvenient. And once that belief settles in, their voice becomes quieter. Their presence becomes smaller. Their natural impulses turn inward. Sometimes the beginnings of timidity come from a parent who was simply too tired, too overwhelmed, or too wrapped in their own struggles to notice the child's inner world. The child does not interpret this as a limitation of the parent. They interpret it as a flaw within themselves. They assume they must stay out of the way. They assume they must not disturb anything. They assume their needs are burdens to be managed quietly. There are also those who grow timid because they grew up around authority that felt too strong. A parent who demanded perfection. A parent who corrected every detail. A parent whose approval felt like sunlight that appeared only when all the conditions were perfect. In such homes, the child learns to tiptoe emotionally. They learn to shrink to avoid criticism. They learn to soften their presence so they won't disappoint anyone. And in time, their timidity becomes so woven into their identity that they forget it ever had an origin. The early years shape how a child sees themselves. When a child is not encouraged to take up emotional space, they grow into adults who flinch at the idea of being fully themselves. They hesitate before sharing opinions. They apologize for existing. They carry their childhood training into every room they enter, adjusting themselves automatically without even noticing. The world sees them as quiet, gentle, reserved, never knowing that much of this quietness came from a place where their deeper self learned to hide. This chapter marks the doorway into understanding timidity not as a personality flaw, but as a protective instinct learned long ago. It is the soft beginning of a story that was written before the child even had words, a story shaped by the emotional weather of their earliest environment. Timidity is not simply a personality trait. It is a psychological adaptation, a pattern rooted in the brain, the body, and the emotional memories that shaped a person long before they understood themselves. To understand why someone becomes timid, it helps to look beneath the behavior and into the quiet mechanisms that guide it. When a child grows up in an environment where emotional safety is inconsistent, the nervous system learns to stay alert. This state is known as hypervigilance, a constant scanning of surroundings for signs of disapproval, anger, or threat. It is not loud or dramatic. It is subtle. an internal tension that never fully relaxes. A timid adult often carries this same alertness into every conversation, every relationship, every new environment. They listen for tone changes. They watch for shifts in body language. They anticipate negative outcomes even when none are present. Timidity is also shaped by attachment, the emotional bond formed with caregivers. A child who experiences unpredictable affection develops anxious or avoidant attachment, two patterns that make expressing oneself feel risky. Anxious attachment creates fear of upsetting others, avoidant attachment creates fear of being vulnerable. Together, they lead to a tendency to withdraw, speak softly, or remain unseen. Timid adults often think they are just quiet, when in reality, their nervous system is trying to prevent the emotional discomfort they once felt as children. Another layer involves fear conditioning. When a child is repeatedly criticized, ignored, or shut down, their brain forms associations. Speaking up equals danger. Being visible equals risk. Asking for help equals rejection. Over time, these associations become automatic. Even as adults, the body reacts as though the original threat is still present. The heart beats faster when they try to express an opinion. The throat tightens when emotions rise. They rehearse sentences in their mind because they fear saying the wrong thing. This is not shyness, it is learned fear. Timidity also connects to self-concept, the internal image a person forms of themselves. A child who grows up believing they must stay small eventually sees themselves as someone who should not take up space. Their identity becomes intertwined with caution. They may think they lack confidence, when in truth, confidence was never given the opportunity to grow. And because this identity forms early, it feels natural, even when it is limiting. The brain is also highly sensitive to emotional experiences during childhood. Neuroscientists call this period a critical window, when neural pathways are shaped by how safe or unsafe the child feels. A child who repeatedly suppresses emotions forms stronger neural pathways for avoidance. A child who is often silenced forms pathways that link expression with danger. These patterns become ingrained, influencing adult behavior without conscious awareness. Social psychology adds another layer. Timid individuals often struggle with spotlight anxiety, the uncomfortable belief that other people are judging them more harshly than they actually are. This is not vanity, it is a fear rooted in early criticism. Their mind assumes the world sees them the same way their parents once did. So they retreat into quietness not because they lack thoughts, but because they fear those thoughts will be misunderstood or rejected. Yet beneath all these psychological mechanisms lies one core truth. Timidity is a protective instinct. It began as a way to stay safe, to reduce conflict, to avoid emotional harm. And though the body grows, the instinct remains, repeating old patterns long after the original environment has changed. This chapter reveals the complex inner architecture of timidity not as a flaw, but as a deeply human response to early emotional experiences. A map of the mind that makes sense once you understand where it came from. Inside every timid person lives a quiet tension, a gentle tug-of-war between who they are and who they learn to be. On the surface, they move softly, speak carefully, and choose their words as if each one carries the weight of an outcome they cannot fully predict. But within them, there is a different story, one filled with desire, hesitation, longing, and fear. A story that rarely finds a voice. Timidity is not the absence of expression, it is the containment of expression. A timid person feels deeply. They think intensely. They notice everything, the mood in a room, the shift in someone's tone, the subtle signals that others overlook. Their inner world is rich, vibrant, and alive. But because they grew up learning that their emotions were too risky to reveal, this inner world stays hidden behind gentle smiles and cautious silence. This creates an emotional conflict that follows them everywhere. The desire to connect, and the fear of being seen. On one side, they crave closeness. They want people to understand them, to hear them, to see the parts of themselves that have remained quiet for years. They long for conversations where they don't have to rehearse every sentence before speaking. They want to be known in a way that feels natural and safe. And deep down, they know they have things worth sharing: thoughts, feelings, insights, even wisdom. But on the other side, fear rises. A fear shaped in childhood, when being visible came with consequences. The fear that if they reveal too much, someone will judge them. If they speak too freely, someone will misunderstand. If they show their authentic self, someone will withdraw. So they learn to stay between the lines, visible enough to function, invisible enough to feel safe. The conflict grows stronger in adulthood, when relationships demand vulnerability. A timid person wants love, yet fears the exposure it requires. They want to speak up, yet their voice feels trapped beneath years of quiet conditioning. They want to take space, yet their body resists the idea as if it were dangerous. They rehearse conversations in their mind, replay interactions, and sometimes regret staying silent, even when speaking felt impossible. There is also the conflict between self-perception and reality. Timid individuals often believe they are burdensome, even when others see them as gentle or thoughtful. They assume their silence is disappointing, even when people around them appreciate their calm presence. They internalize the idea that their needs are too heavy, even when they have never truly tested this belief in safe environments. This mismatch creates emotional exhaustion, wanting more from life but feeling unworthy of it. The inner conflict deepens in moments when they try to break their pattern. Speaking up feels like walking into a storm. Setting boundaries feels like committing a betrayal. Asking for help feels like revealing a weakness. And though none of these things are wrong, their nervous system reacts as though every act of self-expression threatens the fragile balance they learned to maintain as children. Even decisions become complicated. A timid person often hesitates not because they don't know what they want, but because they are afraid their choice might create disappointment. They think of others before themselves, not out of generosity, but out of early survival. The result is a life lived in small steps, even when the heart longs for something bigger. The silent inner conflict is not seen by the world, but it shapes everything: relationships, careers, friendships, even dreams. It is the quiet struggle between an inherited version of themselves and the voice that wants to emerge. A struggle that deserves understanding, not judgment. This chapter uncovers that hidden battle, the soft, internal war between fear and longing, silence and expression, protection and authenticity. There comes a moment, sometimes sudden, sometimes slow, when a timid person begins to sense that their quietness is not simply who they are, but who they had to become. This awareness does not arrive like a loud revelation. It comes gently, the way dawn slowly colors the sky before the sun appears. A soft recognition: something in me is responding to a past that no longer exists. Awareness often begins in ordinary moments. Maybe someone asks a simple question, and the familiar tightness rises in the throat. Maybe they want to share an opinion, and hesitation stops them once again. Maybe they leave a conversation thinking, "Why didn't I say what I wanted to say?" These moments are small, but they add up. They begin to feel less like personality and more like a pattern. For many, the realization emerges in relationships. A timid person may find themselves withdrawing even with people who have never hurt them. They might feel anxious when expressing needs, even though the other person responds with care. The reaction feels older than the relationship itself. And in that gap, they start to see the truth: the fear is not about the present. It is a memory of how things used to be. Awareness deepens when they notice the contrast between their inner world and their outer behavior. Inside, they have thoughts, emotions, and desires full of life. But outside, their actions remain small, filtered, cautious. The distance between these two selves becomes impossible to ignore. The timid adult begins to wonder, why does my real voice stay inside? Who taught me to hide it? Sometimes awareness arrives through watching others. Seeing someone speak freely, express emotions easily, or take up space without apology can create a quiet ache. Not jealousy, but a sense of possibility. A recognition that such emotional freedom exists, and that maybe, one day, it could exist for them too. For others, awareness is triggered by exhaustion. Years of people-pleasing, silent agreement, unspoken feelings, and avoided conflicts slowly wear on the heart. The desire for peace becomes stronger than the fear of being seen. The timid adult starts to feel tired of tiptoeing, tired of shrinking, tired of experiencing life from the edges. And in that tiredness, something begins to open. Awareness is not always comfortable. At first, it can bring sadness, the grief of realizing how much of their life was shaped by old fear. They see the moments where they stayed quiet when they wanted to speak. The relationships where they accepted less than they deserved. The dreams they postponed. The parts of themselves they tucked away. This grief is not weakness, it is the beginning of understanding. But awareness also brings clarity. It reveals that timidity is not a fixed identity. It is a response, a learned behavior. Something shaped by the environment, not by fate. And once this truth settles in, even gently, something inside shifts. The timid person begins to question their automatic reactions. They start to see the child they once were, a child doing their best to feel safe. And with this recognition comes compassion. The turning point is not a single moment of change, but a subtle shift in perspective. Maybe I don't have to be afraid anymore. Not a declaration. Not a sudden transformation. Just a quiet curiosity. A small opening. A possibility. Awareness is the first soft step toward liberation. It does not dismantle timidity immediately, but it creates space for reflection, space for choice, space for growth. And within this space, the timid adult begins to see themselves with new eyes, no longer defined by the past but gently awakening to what the future could become. This chapter marks the beginning of that awakening. Every story shaped by fear carries within it the possibility of becoming softer. Not brighter or louder or radically transformed, just softer. Healing for a timid person does not mean rewriting their entire identity. It means gently loosening the grip of the past so that who they truly are can breathe. It means letting the quietness remain, but removing the fear that once lived inside it. A soft ending is not a conclusion. It is a gradual unfolding. As the timid adult grows into this new space of inner safety, something subtle begins to shift. They no longer carry the same tension in their shoulders when they enter a room. Their voice, still gentle, feels less constrained. Their thoughts, once filtered through layers of caution, now move with more freedom. They start to experience moments, small, delicate moments, where they simply exist without managing themselves. The transformation is not theatrical. No one else may even notice it at first. But internally, the change is undeniable. Where fear once lived, curiosity begins to bloom. Where silence once protected them, expression begins to feel possible. Where self-doubt once whispered in every corner of their mind, a quiet confidence begins to take root. They start saying things they once swallowed. They start taking steps they once avoided. They begin inhabiting their life instead of watching it from the margins. A softer ending also involves forgiveness, not the dramatic kind, but the gentle, private kind. It is the realization that their parents acted from their own limitations, their own histories, their own wounds. This understanding does not excuse the impact, but it creates emotional distance. It allows the timid adult to see that what shaped them was not a reflection of their worth, but of their parents' struggles. And in that understanding, something inside loosens. the burden they carried begins to feel lighter. They also learn to forgive themselves for staying silent, for being afraid, for shrinking, for not knowing sooner. This self-forgiveness is one of the most profound forms of healing. It marks the moment they stop blaming themselves for the patterns they were taught to survive. It marks the moment they begin to speak to themselves with kindness rather than judgment. The timid adult also starts to experience a new kind of presence. They become more aware of their own emotions without fearing them. They begin to trust their instincts. Their relationships deepen as they let others see glimpses of the person behind the quietness. They feel moments of genuine connection, moments where their voice carries warmth instead of hesitation. These experiences build a new internal memory. Perhaps it is safe to be myself. A softer ending does not erase timidity. It transforms its meaning. The person may always be gentle, reflective, observant. They may always prefer calm spaces over loud ones. They may still think before speaking. But these qualities, once shaped by fear, now become expressions of who they truly are. Without the weight of past conditioning, their quietness becomes a strength, a way of moving through the world with thoughtfulness, depth, and presence. The past remains a part of their story, but no longer defines its direction. The timid adult, now more aware, more grounded, more connected to themselves, begins to step into life with a softer confidence. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that holds steady even in stillness. And so the story ends not with triumph, but with gentleness. A quiet reclaiming of self. A slow exhale after years of holding the breath. A soft, steady awareness that they are no longer the child who needed to hide. They are someone who survived,